On the slopes of Diamond Head. This is Kapiolani Community College. Kulia ika nu'u. Strive for the highest.
Aloha. Welcome to BLAW200, Legal Environment of Business. My name's Ben Carroll. Well, last time we kind of wrapped up contracts. We're going to be looking a little bit more at contracts today when we talk about contracts online. We talk about e-business, so we'll revisit them a little bit. But first off, let's start out with our usual review of last time. Okay, so if you look, we covered how to interpret contracts, and we started with privity of contract. So we want to know what we mean by privity, and can someone recover under a contract without privity? You recall privity is simply the relationship of two people in the contract. So normally the rights and obligations of a person are governed by the contract, and it applies only to those people. So someone outside the contract, even if they had some interest in it or were benefited by it, wouldn't normally have any rights. So a third party is not in privity. Now, there are some instances when a third party might obtain rights, and one of those was assignment. So a person can assign rights or delegate duties to another person in many instances, and then that person would stand in the place. And you recall this happens typically if you had a promissory note where someone owed you money, you could transfer that, and then they would owe money to the assignee, the new person, and that person would have the rights to obtain the money. And if the assignment was complete, you would no longer have rights. Those rights would have been transferred. Now, another way is if you're an intended third-party beneficiary, and you recall that third-party beneficiary is someone who is mentioned in the contract, and there is an intent that they benefit from the contract. And we use two easy examples, and that's where the actual one of the contracting parties actually died. And so they certainly couldn't enforce the contract, but those particular kinds of contracts were intended to allow someone else to enforce them. So that would be a beneficiary of an insurance policy or a beneficiary of a will. And they are intended, and they would be able to enforce the contract rights. Now, the other kind we talked about was an incidental beneficiary. That's someone who might benefit from a contract, but there's not an intent that they be part of the contract or that they have enforceable rights. Okay, we talked about performance. So we want to know what substantial performance is, and we also want to take a look at satisfactory performance. So substantial performance is simply an assessment that the contract has been performed to such an extent that it should remain in effect. So you can have absolutely no performance, in which case the contract is breached and you would look for your remedies. But if there's been substantial performance, it's a determination that the contract has been, for the most part, or to a sufficient degree, completed. And so the contract would be held to be in effect, although of course you might have damages for the amount of performance that had not occurred. In other words, you did not get full performance. Now, this is different from what we call satisfaction contracts, and that's where the contract is to be performed to the satisfaction of another person. And typically this might involve something aesthetic. In other words, painting a picture of the family, and the idea is that performance is if in fact the person is satisfied with the painting. Now, we're going to apply a good faith test here, and this is different from satisfaction of a more general sense, such as you will produce a roof that is weatherproof, and we would use a more objective standard there rather than the subjective standard of whether I like it. Okay. What are some situations in which a court may find impossibility to perform a contract? Now, we looked at several instances where something had happened that wasn't foreseeable that would allow someone out of a contract. And you may have heard the term previously, acts of God, and this is the sort of thing where a disaster happens or something beyond the control of the parties, and there may be a feeling that the contract can't be performed, and so we will look at our other remedies. The obvious example would be if the subject matter of the contract is destroyed. Obviously, at that point, there's no ability for that side to perform. We'd also talked a little bit about frustration, and we talked about that you can actually make provision for these types of occurrences with different clauses in your contract. So we mentioned the force majeure, the stronger force, meaning that you can put a provision in that in the event of war, etc., contract will not be enforced. Or you could put the other side saying simply, regardless of what happens, performance is expected. And we talked internationally, there's kind of a mid-ground where we talk about hardship. What are some situations in which a contract may be terminated by operation of law? So things may occur legally that indicate the contract cannot be finished. So the law may change, or something may happen such as bankruptcy, where the law intervenes and it affects the contract rights. What's the difference between incidental and consequential damages? And can you obtain both in the same lawsuit? So these are compensatory damages, and of course we dealt with compensatory damages in tort, but these are specific to the contract. So the incidental damages are the damages arising out of the breach. And you remember in our example with the roof, to have the roof fixed or to have someone else pay for doing it, that would be the incidental damages. Now the consequential damages are something foreseeable from the breach. They are indirect, however. And that would be, for example, if things in the house were damaged, and there were some losses there. So these are both of compensatory damages, and we can ask for both of these, and will ask for both of these in our suit. Okay. How about liquidated damages, and what is specific performance? Okay. Liquidated damages, the term liquidated means turning into cash, and what this means that we have in advance of performing a contract, in the contract document itself, we have figured out what the estimated loss would be if the contract is breached. So we have made a pre-estimate that this is what's going to result if the contract is breached. And we've actually put that amount in the contract itself. So normally we would figure out what our damages are after the fact, what were needed to be compensated. But this is an instance where we have determined in advance if it's breached, this is expected to be our damages. Now, we can't just make up a wild and woolly number that might be considered a penalty. But if we have a reasonable estimate of damage, and again, these damages are often hard to estimate, but if we do a reasonable estimate, we can obtain those. And I think the example we used is in a construction contract, you could actually have liquidated damages if various deadlines were missed. The idea being to encourage people to meet their deadlines because there are set amounts paid if not. Now, specific performance is one of our equitable remedies, and in a sense it's similar to the equitable remedy we looked at in torts, where the court can tell somebody do something, don't do something. In other words, our injunctive relief. And this is an instance where the court will tell a party to a contract to perform specifically what they said they would. So this is causing a person to go through with the contract when they have indicated or have breached the contract. And the idea here, as with all equitable remedies, is that the money damages won't really put the person, non-breaching person, back where they should be. So this is an instance where the subject matter of the contract is unique, and allowing the other side just to pay the damages won't really do it. So the example we used was a famous painting or piece of land which is unique, and the court would say, you will perform, you will transfer the painting or the land, you will specifically perform your obligations under the contract. Okay, well, today we're going to look at e-commerce, and as I noted, we'll talk a little bit about contracts here, because a lot of contracting now is going over the airwaves. So we're going to start out with looking at generally how the internet affects all of us. In other words, business, personal, etc. And we'll specifically look at some instances where tort and contract law has been impacted. Then we'll look at what we call e-commerce and e-contracts. We'll talk about online transactions and some of the possibilities there, such as shrink wrap and online acceptance. Talk a little bit about e-signatures and security, although that's a big area, we'll just touch on it. Talk about a few statutes that are attempting to regulate the area, and then just very briefly note some of the international issues, since obviously World Wide Web is worldwide. Okay. So, don't want to repeat what you've learned in your ICS class or your computer classes, but just to note that the Internet and World Wide Web are not really synonyms, although people sometimes tend to use them that way. So the Internet I tend to think of as the structure, so I don't see any of the IT folks around that can call me on oversimplifying this, but I think of the Internet as being the structure, in a sense, the kind of the hardware. And the Internet does things other than just the World Wide Web. So email, transfer of things happens on the Internet. Now, the World Wide Web is a little bit newer, and we think of that really as the content. So these are the various documents that are on the Internet, on the computers, that are all attached together, linked together on the Internet. So we think of the World Wide Web as actually being the content. Okay, so what are some of the features? Let's just think about Internet, how the Internet's changed things, what's different about the Internet, the way we handle our personal affairs, do business, etc. So what is it how would we characterize the Internet? What are some features of it that have changed from pre-Internet? Okay, one thing, it's lightning fast. So assuming that you don't have dial-up any longer, hopefully you have a quick attachment, and information can transmit faster than faxes, faster than anything. Okay, so we can both receive information very quickly, and we can disseminate it, and we can disseminate it broadly. So we can post something, and it's immediately available to billions of people. Okay, no other medium can do that. It's everywhere. So you'll hear the term ubiquitous. So that means that it's everywhere. It's in our daily lives. It's all around us. Okay, it's global, and there are standards that have come up, and for the most part, everything can talk to everything else. Occasionally we have some glitches where connections are problematic, but for the most part, worldwide we can connect. All the different computers, all the different places are hooked together because we're using some standards for transmitting information electronically. Okay, of course it's convenient. Okay, if you're taking an online class, you may be sitting at home in your underwear and able to do this anytime, day or night. So it is 24/7, and that's extremely convenient when you think of something. It's kind of instant gratification. You can usually do things, and many sites, most sites are open all the time. Okay, it's informative in the sense that there are all kinds of multimedia, all kinds of different documents are on the Internet. So we can have pictures, we can have diagrams, you can actually ask for particular types of documents when we do our searches, and also it's very dense. The information is packed, so we've got all these computers linked together. There's just millions of whatever bigger than gigabytes are, zigabytes, whatever. So a lot of information there, and it's, shall we say, intelligent and interactive. So it's not simply getting and transmitting information, it's doing that in an interactive way. So you can pose questions. It will guess what you're trying to ask. There's a lot of features there like that. And you can customize and personalize. So for businesses particularly, if it detects that a customer is coming from a particular place, it can tailor things. It can send only that zip code stuff back. So there's a lot that happens there that's different from prior ways that we did things. Okay, so let's think about some online tort issues. So when we talked about torts, there's probably just a couple of things that will come to mind that you'll wonder about. So one of the things we looked at with torts is if we are injured, where we would file. Okay, so we would have to file in the proper jurisdiction. Now, if we're injured online, the question is, where we know where we are, but where was the perpetrator? Where is this actually happening? Okay, now to some extent we had a taste of that previously if somebody talked on the telephone to establish a contract or use the fax, but it's even more vague sometimes now where people are actually located. But we'll look at some of those issues. Now, just one example I want to bring up with the tort is how easy it is to defame someone now or to invade their privacy. So some of those intentional torts are much easier now technologically to cause harm. For example, in the past, if we published something that was defamatory, if there was a publication subject to libel, they could simply gather up the book, stop publication, etc. But think about now, put up on the internet, it's there. Instantaneously, it's everywhere. You can take it down, but so what? It's millions of people in split seconds have got copies of that. So very hard to bring it back, very hard to correct that. Same thing if you reveal trade secrets. And you can imagine just the fact that you can post something and instantaneously billions of people have access to it can really change the complexion of a number of those types of lawsuits. And of course there are different cyber crimes and cyber torts that are only able to be done over the internet. So various types of fraud and that sort of thing. Okay, so again, if we look at some of those practical tort issues, we have to look at the personal and subject matter jurisdiction. You recall that long-arm statutes mean we can, kind of a word picture of reaching out from the jurisdiction and grabbing someone someplace else. There's some problems with anonymity. We don't know exactly who has posted things. There are ways to protect your identity online, and you can use someone else's computer, etc. And this question of what law governs. So again, this is, in a sense, a jurisdictional issue, but these are some of the things that come up with torts because of the internet. Okay, how about contracts? So we've already hinted at a lot of contracting, a lot of business is now happening over the internet. And so how does this change what we're used to? Okay, well, you can imagine we're not face-to-face when we're negotiating necessarily. We're not looking necessarily at the same document. We may even be doing this at different times. So there's a lot more written that we're looking at as opposed to oral contracts. There's some questions about, is the person on the other side who you think it is? So again, some of these we've looked at similar to the tort issues, but there's some other aspects as well. So if we look at the practical issues of what's online, identity and capacity of the parties, whether the signature is valid, so we'll talk a little bit about how we ensure that. The terms and conditions, and we'll be looking at this in a little while, how we know all the pieces that fit together in the contract, because if we get something in writing or a notation of writing, we've got it in front of us. It may not be that clear online. Again, when and where the contract is formed, and once again, the governing law. So we need to figure out what law applies if we're in different places and it's not stated in our agreement what law applies. Okay, so we've used the term e-commerce, and you will find many, many definitions of e-commerce. So if you happen to Google e-commerce, you'll get however many hits that is, thousands and thousands. So there are some differences with e-commerce. You will actually find people describing differences between e-commerce and e-business. We're not going to really go there, but we're going to use e-commerce in a very general sense to mean buying, selling, transferring, etc., using computers on the internet. Okay, so it would also include not just buying and selling, but obviously internal things you would do, servicing customers, e-learning, etc. So all of this would be under the rubric of e-commerce, and we're going to use it in that broad sense. Okay, there are a lot of acronyms that have come up, B2B, B2C, C2C, etc. And these are simply indicating the parties involved in these transactions, and there's a very long list. So you have interactions with government, etc., and I've seen lists that go 15, 20 long, talking about all the possible combinations of who's dealing with who. Okay, so obviously these are all e-commerce, and if you're in marketing and some other disciplines, then these distinctions make a lot of difference to you. Okay, just to look at some of the familiar companies involved here. These are probably everybody's been in touch with one or more of these. So we think of auction on eBay, Amazon Books, banking by almost everybody nowadays. Dell Computers started out internet, had no stores originally. People trying to get a job use Monster and other websites. A lot of real estate and retail on, shipping, stock, and a lot of travel companies, air companies, etc. So all of these, it's pervasive. Most people are involved daily with interacting on the internet with various companies. So a little bit of history, and this is completely subjective. So if you look for internet history or e-commerce history or any of those sort of things, if you Google it, you'll find all different ways of slicing and dicing this. So you can look at the technology when they had secure transmissions, when they first came up with the browsers. So you can look at it straight from technology developments. You can look at it at companies, when the companies came in, and I took kind of, again, a very broad view. So to me, when we started using kind of online money in the sense of credit cards are used, so they're taking place of the normal way of doing it. When electronic data and electronic fund transfer started, and mostly these were company to company. At this point, consumers weren't actively involved. But then in the 70s, online shopping and using automated teller machines started. We got to where we actually started naming domains. People started getting on the internet. And then finally, with the personal computers came out. And of course, IBM made that very pervasive in the 80s. Then we had the first really good web browser. Previously, you had to be a little bit of a techie to use some of the search and connection capabilities. Amazon Book opened. Everybody originally thought, how's that going to work? eBay started up. Okay, Google and PayPal. Apple launches iTunes. Okay, YouTube starts, and iPhone's introduced. So again, just a quick journey down recent memory lane, just to show how this is developed, and you see like technology, it happens moving at a much faster pace. So obviously we could have the 90s could be, and the 2000s could be very full, and it's kind of fun if you look on the internet to see some of these historical developments you may recall. So okay, so what are the benefits of e-commerce? Well, these are all familiar to everyone. So easier to set it up, not much infrastructure required. Almost anybody can help you put up a website. You'll want to get a good one, but it's easy to do. A lot easier to compare things. So you don't have to get a whole bunch of books. You don't have to get a whole bunch of ads. You can click through. So hypertext allows you to do things very fast and very completely. And we've already talked about the convenience. So you can do it when the fancy strikes you. Okay, some of the drawbacks. Well, there's some things you really want to touch. You know, if you're buying a comforter or a bed or something, picture of it isn't quite the same, you know, and you can't smell the perfume over the air, that sort of thing. So there's certain things where you would actually want to be personally involved, okay? And you may just like that for certain kinds of purchases. There's obviously some fraud and security concerns. Everybody has been approached through the email and the phishing and the online fraud types of things. There's still a lack of familiarity and a lack of comfort with a lot of people with the online environment. It seems impersonal. And of course, younger generation is getting a little more in touch with that this is a good way to connect, but there's still some resistance among a large part of the population. And then there's some limitations. So if you don't have a credit card, you are limited in your ability to access a fair amount of the e-commerce that's going on. Okay, some legal issues for the companies, for the businesses that are online. There are additional risks, not only your regular business risks, but now there are additional risks that have to do with your information, how that is used and possibly stolen online or misused online, and just the technology issues as well, because you become dependent on this medium, and you need to be careful that you're covered if you have a backup plan, crisis plan, redundancy built in as well. There's certainly some privacy concerns, and so we'll be looking at online. You will need to look and see what the privacy policy is. So most websites will have a place where you go and they say how they would use any information that they get from you. So there's certainly some concerns there. The internet is, up till now, essentially unregulated for the most part. It's self-regulated, but of course the government is looking into certain kinds of controls, etc. And there's some talk about even taxing businesses on the internet. And that's interesting because usually the taxing is by the people where the business is. Again, we talked about where is the business. Okay. And then again, the security concerns we've already hinted at with password protection, digital signatures, encryption, etc. Okay, so when you're contracting online, what's different about when you're contracting in person? Okay, well, you need to look, certainly, are there terms that relate to the method that you're using? Are there things that we want to have in there that are dependent on being online? And where do we find it? Because, again, we don't have a single contract. There may be different places if we're actually doing business on a website that we need to look. Okay. What are the concerns we have about this methodology? In other words, we haven't necessarily seen it. Is the picture accurate? Is the description accurate? Are we concerned about the subject matter? How are we going to deal with disputes? Okay, if we go down to a store and we deal with somebody and we have a problem, we know how to get hold of them. We know what our remedies are. Okay, so again, we've talked a little bit about these, but we need to look at these in light of being online and being a little bit less personal and farther away, not face-to-face. Okay, so digital signature is an encryption-based code that is ours. So it's like password protection, and so it's being more and more accepted that this will guarantee that the person's there. Now it's like your PIN number or whatever. If you let that out, then you have those kinds of problems, because literally the other side, it's just like your signature. Okay. Okay, so every contract that you do electronically, of course, you're looking at the same contract things that we talked about before. You're going to want to make sure all the right pieces are there, but there's actually a few more twists here. So you do want to make sure what the remedies are. And again, the reason is that some of your face-to-face remedies and your ability to chase after somebody and to get satisfaction are going to be limited if they're on the other side of the world. So you would want to see what those remedies are. And for example, eBay and some of the regular online commercial sites will have provisions frequently for ADR, in other words, online mediation or even arbitration. So there will be provisions for what to do if you have a problem. And that's particularly important if you're not close to the... How do you accept? Okay, and we'll look at that in a minute. Most of you have already done this, so it seems rather easy, but there's some questions we'll have about that. What are the acceptable forms of payment? And as we suggested, anymore, credit card's a good thing, but there now is PayPal. There are some accepting ways of accepting your checks online, that sort of thing. So you want to be familiar with what is acceptable payment. And As noted, you also want to be worried about taxing and shipping costs. As we know anymore, sometimes the shipping cost looks like more than the original purchase. So you want to see how that's handling the timings and all that sort of thing. Again, we talked about remedies, return and refund policy. Want to see if there are any disclaimers, and we'll be talking about disclaimers of liability and various kinds of disclaimers of warranties in one of our next sessions. And as we mentioned, what the privacy policy is. Are they going to give your email or your information to anyone else? And you want to be real clear what that looks like. Okay, as I hinted at, one of the concerns is when you get to a site, there may be a button to click that says I accept or okay or whatever, but unlike having all of your contract in one place, a single document, there may be various places on this website that give you different information, and these are terms of your contract. So very rarely do you have everything on one page and you go to the bottom and say accept, decline, etc. Usually you'll go here to get your shipping information, over here to see what your remedies are, over here to see if there's other concerns. So if you've done, for example, an airline ticket, you'll see that the cashing it back in is here, picking it up is there, changing it's there. You've got to go a bunch of different places, so it's not as easy to make sure that you have all of the provisions. And if you're actually trying to print it out, you better hope there's a little thing over here that says print friendly, because otherwise, it's hard to get all these pieces together. So that's one concern. And again, you want to be real careful with what the remedies are if things go wrong. Okay, if everything's fine, great. But because of the distance, because of the kind of lack of personal connection, you want to know what to do if it all falls apart. Okay, so click on agreement. So you may be familiar with this term. And this is the normal way we're going to accept. Okay, so this is actually what we call an end user license agreement, and we'll talk about when you're buying software in the future slide, but we call this an end user license agreement, and this is our regular kind of buttons here. And you can see that I decline or I accept. And if you look at the bar on the right side, this is a whole long agreement. Okay, so there's a lot there. And then you can see down in the corner, it does say printable version. So in this instance, this agreement is in fact all in one place, and that's a good thing because many are not. As I said, if you use Amazon or you use a number of the other sites, you will find you have to go different places to find where all your provisions are. Okay, so another possibility is when you're doing your payment, and this again is what we call a click-on agreement, and you can see these little buttons, you just actually put your mouse over it and click on it. It doesn't say accept or anything, but these are called radio buttons, and this is a very typical way that you would make a payment or agree to things. So again, if you refer to click on agreement, that means this is your acceptance. So by clicking on this, that is saying I accept the offer. And again, keep repeating the proviso. Make sure that you look around and you see what the offer is, that you have all of the pieces of it, all of the provisions that you need. Okay, shrink wrap agreement. What is a shrink wrap agreement? Okay, shrink wrap is the plastic wrap that's always on the boxes of software you get. So we just use that as a generic term, and this is the packaging. And typically the packaging will say, by opening this package, you are agreeing to X. Okay, but what's interesting here is what they're asking you to agree to is not on the outside. Okay, so they may tell you, you are agreeing to what's inside. Now, what strikes you about that? Well, some of the exercises we've done previously, you need to read your contract. You need to know what it is you're agreeing to, because the court wants to enforce something that's been bargained and agreed to. And here, they're saying you agree to something you may not have read yet. Okay, so with respect to shrink wrap agreements, the court says that you have to have an opportunity to read it. So you need to, even though you by supposedly opening this, and you see this sometimes on your CDs as well, where it says breaking this seal means you agree to the terms, blah, blah. Actually, you have a reasonable opportunity to read and review what it is you're agreeing to before you agree. So regardless of what it says on the outside, you have a reasonable opportunity. Now, if you open it up, read it, and then use it, the use means you have agreed to it. But if you open it up, decide that's not what I want, you haven't agreed to it. So again, regardless of what it says on the outside, if the provisions that you're agreeing to are on the inside, you have the opportunity to look at those and agree or not. Okay, we want to look at a couple of the statutes that are involved here. So the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act is a model state law, and it talks about kind of the nitty-gritty, electronic signatures, records, contracts. And this has been adopted in 46 states. So if you agree to be bound by UITA, then you will be able to interact with these other 46 states, and everything will be interpreted the exact same way. Okay. So talks about errors, talks about effective time, and it recognizes digital signatures. Again, these are kind of the basics of our e-commerce. Now, there's another statute coming up that has not been adopted by many folks. So this legislation right now has only been adopted in 2. And so this talks more about the uses of information, so it's much broader, and it's an attempt to get kind of the to organize and standardize interactions on the internet, and states haven't yet bought into this. Okay, so this talks about the different kinds of contracts that may be online, particularly purchasing software online, computer programs, databases, etc. And again, it's much more all-encompassing, but the states haven't bought into it, and several states have actually indicated they don't like it, and you're not required to follow it in their state. So it's like a negative vote for this. So you can see if we're concerned about this in the U.S., even more problematic is when we're dealing with other countries. So let's take a quick look at some of the global issues, and then this is really just a repeat of some of the issues that we've already looked at. So you can see, in addition to the jurisdictional problems, we've got intellectual property, and as we talked about previously, this differs from state to state. We've got cybercrime, and again, all of these differ in different countries. We're talking about the technical standards, and to a large extent, those are being standardized across the world. But these are even more exacerbated. These get more problematic as we're dealing with more and more countries, and we have less similarities with each other. We'll touch on some of these down the road as well. Okay, so what are the continuing issues? Well, electronic payment, big deal is security, how we deal with breaches when we're in different places, and just the mechanical things about dealing with data. Okay. A lot of these could also be looked at as ethical issues, so we have deceptive trade practices, intellectual property violations. There are some countries that do not have strong protection, so certainly in copyright, trademark, patenting, there's some issues, and we talked a little bit about those with intellectual property. Product disparagement, and there's privacy concerns, because more and more companies are trying to track what the issues are. Okay, so we'd like to talk to people a little bit about the growth of the internet, so we'll have a chat with some folks that can give us a little information about that. Okay. Aloha. We've been talking about the internet and e-commerce, so I wanted to share with people some of your background and experiences and get a different perspective on this. So let them know who you are, Tom, and what you've done in the past.
Well, at the moment, I'm a lecturer here at KCC in the BLT department, just like you are. I'm teaching a couple of sections of ICS 100. I've got several sections scheduled into the future.
That's the basic computer class introduction?
That's exactly correct. And I've been involved with computers for some time. I've just about made 40 years. I started getting involved about in 1971. And as an undergraduate, I started teaching, and I've done various and sundry things over the past 4 decades, including but not limited to a whole lot of commerce on the internet and a whole lot of support and consulting in the internet milieu.
So in addition to the teaching, you've got the practical experience of actually dealing with e-commerce.
Yeah, I'm the outsource IT department for several dozen firms in town. So yeah, it melds nicely together. I really enjoy teaching. Having that practical experience is very helpful.
Well, I can see by hair color you've been around about as long as I have, so we can probably kind of look at the history of the internet. And I always think of the internet kind of being as the structure or the highway, and the World Wide Web as being more like the software or the interface. Can you give a little more technical or a little more practical description, or does that work?
Well, there was an internet before the World Wide Web. There was a character cell-based internet that academicians used. It wasn't particularly popular. Once the World Wide Web came out, once that first browser, the Netscape browser came out, then the growth of internet utilization went way up. And coincidentally, bandwidth availability for the internet has gone way up. And this whole experience in terms of what people use the internet for has just kept marching forward. There was, as I said, character cell, then there was graphical content, sound came on board eventually, pictures, moving pictures. I think some people are serving 3D content now, and we've needed more and more bandwidth to get these richer and richer experiences. We need more CPU capability, just computational capability and computer capability, storage capability to be able to sort of keep up with all of this expansion. And who knows where it's going to go. It continues to move forward.
Well, the initial kinds of access to computer, as I recall, was the computer that's the size of a room, and you carry a box of cards that many of the younger folks might not even recognize that you enter into the computer. And it's pretty much just typing in and looking at a green or orange or whatever color screen. And as you indicate now, we've got pictorial content, and I guess the interface has changed so that we feel more active with that. How fast is this changing? I heard something about at least storage capacity. I mean, change doubles every so often. Can you give a sense of how quickly things are moving?
Well, there's this concept called Moore's Law, no relation. And that suggests that I think it's every year, every couple of years, computational power doubles. And it's really quite amazing. Storage is gone to a ridiculous level. Consumers can actually buy 3 terabytes of storage, which is an unimaginably large amount of storage. The first computer I ever had with a hard disk had a 10 megabyte hard disk. You can do the arithmetic and see what the difference is. A 30 megabyte hard disk used to be $300. I can get a 2 terabyte hard disk, an external one, for under $100 now, delivered. So basically, consumers have available to them virtually infinite amounts of storage at this juncture.
Well, before we get into the e-commerce side, since you do teach that introductory computer class, what would you like to share with people that haven't been fortunate enough to take your class to understand about kind of the basics of technology or computer use? So there's some tips you would have for folks, and how to approach what's happening in technology.
Well, You know, it's funny, I do have a goal for my students, and it's basically to make them better clients, because I deal with all these dozens and dozens of people. And what's most frustrating really to me about my clients is that their pain threshold is much too high. They don't complain enough, nor do they complain fast enough. And I would suggest to people that if they're physically uncomfortable in their chair, or if they're psychologically uncomfortable in what they're doing, it seems to them, this is too hard, there must be an easier way. Most of the time, they're probably right. And it's a real win-win if those issues get addressed. It's good for them, their morale goes up, they're less likely to quit their job. It's good for their company because they're more likely to get more done, they'll be more productive, and coincidentally, it makes the organization more profitable. So I would suggest to people to be mindful about a better way to do things. There's a tendency for people to continue to use the same technique they learned the first time to accomplish something. And you know, a whole lot of people are on-the-job trained. So you know, be creative, you know, be investigative, you know, try and find out if there's a better way.
So it's getting more comfortable with your technology so that you know when to change, when to search for a better use.
Absolutely. The environment changes very quickly, and you know, some people like the environment to change quickly, and some people don't. Older people tend not to like it to change that quickly. You don't necessarily need to get the latest and greatest stuff to have the most productivity, but it's really helpful just to be mindful and contemplative, sort of, about how things can be done better, because very often there is a better way than you're using now. And the way that we've, quote, always done it probably isn't the best option. And this is especially true for things you do all the time. You know, if you do something every once in a while, if you do something once a year, once a quarter, once a month, yeah, well, you know, who cares? But if you're doing something, you know, six times an hour, and it's irritating you and it's making you go home and kick the dog, you know, that's the kind of thing you really want to look into trying to figure out a better way to do.
Okay. Now, in terms of business, obviously the technology has changed things dramatically, and particularly over as long a time as you've talked about. What kind of hints can you give people about how to deal with doing business online, what we call e-commerce these days? What's different about that than how we've always done it in the past?
Everything. I mean, there was a point in time when the only way you could do commerce of any sort, there was no e-commerce, was face-to-face. You know, and in general, you had a relationship. I mean, we're talking about, well, not before horses, but before any sort of mechanized transportation, the only people you could do business with were people that you could walk to you, or you would walk to them, or they would walk to you. And that has just expanded and expanded and expanded to the point now where I regularly do business with people who don't speak my language and don't live in my country. You know, it used to be I had a relationship with the people that I did business with, or people had a relationship. Now it's by remote control. And so a lot of the assumptions that you used to be able to make, I can trust Harry because I can go over to Harry's house if these bananas aren't fresh. You know, that doesn't work when I'm buying something out of Shanghai or Peking or Brussels. And I have to use other mechanisms to be confident that this source or these people are credible. I have to have other mechanisms and means to be able to ensure that I have recourse in case something goes wrong with the transaction.
So the previous trust and the ability to deal with someone face-to-face is now just gone in a lot of your work.
It's pretty much gone. You can have a long-run relationship in an electronic environment, but it's the exception, not the rule. And it's not just an issue of distance. I recently purchased a car off of Craigslist. I shared with a friend that how well the transaction went. He said, "Well, you were lucky. The CL in Craigslist stands for cheaters and liars or chumps and losers." And, it doesn't always go well. I tried to purchase a Nook, and someone was advertising the Nook over and over again, and every time I tried to follow up with them, they basically sent me a piece of spam mail with links in it that had viruses. So just because a source works one day doesn't mean it'll necessarily work the other day. You have to be covered. You have to have basically a secure site, and you have to kind of know what you're doing.
When we see, I know when you have HTTP for your protocol, if you have S, is that some semblance of security on a site, or?
It provides you with a little bit of security. It's more secure than a site without the S, suffice it to say.
Okay. But you'd probably want a number of other things that you go over, I'm sure, in ICS, firewall and fires protection and all that sort of thing as well, just a mechanical protection.
Exactly. Okay. Hardware firewall in a router is really good. That's kind of fundamental. Some kind of antivirus software. You don't necessarily have to pay for it. The paid ones aren't necessarily even the best. Some kind of malware or spyware control. If you have those things, you're fairly much covered. But the problem is, because of social engineering, people make mistakes. They're inclined to click on things that can harm them. Opening attachments, clicking on pop-ups, clicking on links, all of those things can make you more vulnerable.
So sometimes when you get spam and it says, if you don't want any more spam, click here, it's a bad idea to click there because you're just letting them know they got a live address.
That's exactly correct.
Be quite careful.
Yeah.
Okay.
It depends on the credibility of the firm. If it's a big, well-known Fortune 500 company that you happen to be on their mailing list and you want to get off their mailing list, then that'll work. But if it's unknown, it's coming from some random location that you don't recognize, you have no recollection of how that started, trying to make it stop will probably make it worse, just as you said.
Well, it's interesting that you also talked about the dispute resolution. I know you have some background in that. How is that handled online as opposed to a lot of times we do face-to-face kind of resolving our issues?
There's one associate of mine in town who actually specializes in, for example, eBay dispute resolution. And all of the conversations, in quotes, are handled via email. It's not the traditional way of doing it that I was taught when I got my GCCR, Graduate Certificate in Conflict Resolution, but it's effective. I mean, he's been doing it for years, and he's served quite a few clients doing it. There are other mechanisms now available that are a little bit more sophisticated. Video conferencing, for example. Lots of people are familiar with Skype. Lots of people have webcams. They can do that kind of thing from their iPhone at this point. So you don't necessarily have to be in physical proximity to do a face-to-face dispute resolution. In my experience, it's uncommon though. Usually, in the case of eBay, it's eBay that handles the dispute resolution. Just this week, I got reimbursed for a transaction out of Hong Kong. Someone sent me some fraudulent counterfeit materials, and I basically whined and moaned and complained, and I got my money back. It took a little grunting and groaning to do it, but I stood my ground.
One thing I noticed when I've been doing any kinds of transactions online is that, contrary to everything being together, like signing a contract or doing a transaction where it's all together, seems like online that you got to click here, click there, go all over the place to really find out what it is you're agreeing to. Any thoughts about how people ought to protect themselves when they're actually contracting online or buying something online?
Well, it's hard to be optimistic about that because people don't tend to read contracts that they sign in person with a pen. And the kinds of contracts that they don't recognize that when they click, they're signing, in effect. Those things are laborious to read as well. And the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time, simply ignore them. That's not necessarily a good idea. It's really worthwhile to read every once in a while at least some of those contracts, because you might be surprised just what terms and conditions you're allowing. Big companies, Microsoft-y kind of big companies, get permission from you in those disclaimer click-throughs that give them permission to modify software on your machine, to modify to monitor what you do. People might be shocked. It's a good idea, if not to look at every single one, look at them every once in a while just to see the kinds of things that you're agreeing to.
So when you click I agree, it may not be just right there that you're agreeing to. It's all over the place, different links and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And those agreements go on for pages and pages. Sometimes you have to actually scroll through to the bottom before you can click agree. And you can also print them out. Rushing is bad. Just in general, when there's haste, there can, I don't know about waste, but there can be regret. So it's sometimes a good idea to just be patient.
And I know we've talked before, and it kind of to wrap up, you have a sense about how people kind of view technology that you shared with me, of their trust in it and whatever. A final...
Sure. Well, there's a false sense of credibility in technical relationships. There's a false sense of authority. People, when they see things on their screen, they just tend to believe it. And they tend to click on things thoughtlessly. If someone were to come up and knock on their door and they open the door and they said, give me your underwear, they wouldn't do it. But they get something pop up on the screen that says, click here and I'll protect you, and they click and bad things can happen. So just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they aren't out to get you. Caveat emptor still does apply.
Okay, so buyer beware.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I hope that's been useful to you to see where this is going. Obviously a very changing field. There's more information on the website that gives you some other places to look if in fact this is an area of interest to you. So we will be next time looking at the UCC. We're going into a large area, important area in business law, so we'll be looking at the Uniform Commercial Code, and we'll be starting out with an overview and also looking at sales. So this is Ben Carroll saying aloha from BLAW200.